are going to talk for about half an hour and do a little bit more context setting for this conference, and we're going to talk about this moment in the LGBT movement. So we're going to talk about three things. First of all, we're going to talk briefly about what it is we're trying to achieve. That is, why are we here today? Then we're going to talk a little bit about how we're doing, not just in the last 2 years, but over the last decade. And then we're going to share 10 observations on where we find ourselves now, what are some of the challenges, what are some of the opportunities, and what does that mean for us going forward. So we're going to start by briefly just talking about what it is that we're trying to achieve.
We'll start with who we are. So this slide shows some great data we're able to get from the Census Bureau now about the LGBT community. And you'll see the first number up there is that at the Williams Institute, we estimate there are about 9 million LGBT adults, about 4% of the population. It turns out about 3% self-identify as that. If you ask people if they've had sex with somebody of the same sex in the last year, we could ask all of you, about 4% will answer that question that they have. If you ask somebody, if you ask the population if they've had sex with ever in their life with somebody of the same sex, that's about 7 to 9%. We don't have great data on the trans communities. We're working on that, and starting in June, there's going to be a series of expert roundtables to design the questions to really get at that data. What we do know from a number of data sets is that our community is raising about 2 million children.
And some of you have seen another version of this before, but to just talk briefly about what we're all doing here today. You know, at MAP, we think about it as that we're really aiming for equal opportunity in American life. And by that, we don't just mean some parts of life, but all parts of life. And since all of life is hard to encapsulate on a slide, we conveniently grouped it into 5 key areas for you. One is pursuing health and happiness, and so this is both physical health and mental health. So this is aiming for a society that's free of stigma and discrimination. It means having competent health care providers, the ability to extend health insurance to partners and children, the ability to earn a living, which means not being unfairly fired from your job, having the same benefits as other coworkers, having the same tax credits as other Americans. The ability to serve your country, not just in the military, but also volunteerism in public office. And to be safe in communities, which is not just freedom from hate crimes, but also being safe in places of worship, being safe in public schools. And last but certainly not least, being able to take care of the people that we love, and that includes families, marriage, being able to adopt children, being able to take leave to take care of a sick spouse. So what is it that this movement is fighting for? This movement is fighting to give LGBT Americans the same chance as everyone else to pursue health and happiness, earn a living, serve their country, be safe in their communities, and take care of the ones they love.
So how do we reach those goals? You're going to hear throughout the conference about a lot of the great work that you're doing, that the organizations are doing, that a lot of great people are doing, but we lump it into 3 main strategies. We need to change public opinion. We need to win the hearts and minds of America. We need to change the rules or the laws, or what we lawyers call reach formal legal equality, so that LGBT people are treated the same under the law at the federal level in all 50 states. And we need to change, we need to improve our shared lived experience. We need to eliminate those disparities that research documents in terms of health, mental health, substance abuse, income, between LGBT and other people. And what we know is that all 3 of these areas interact with each other. We have to change the hearts and minds to change the laws. When we change those things, our lived experience will change as well. So how are we doing? What we're going to do now is walk through kind of a snapshot today of how we're doing on reaching these goals with a focus on kind of formal legal equality. So I won't go through everything on this slide, but we've had in the last couple of years the first 2 bills from Congress passed that are pro-LGBT, and really a large number of administrative successes. When the Department of Labor decided that the Family Medical Leave Act meant that employees could take unpaid leave to take care of their children of an unmarried same-sex partner, that impacted 100,000 children and over 50,000 families. When the Census Bureau recently decided for the first time to report married couples as such, it changed our estimates at the Williams Institute of the number of married couples by doubling them, the number of same-sex married couples in the country. We released last week new numbers that we believe there are over 80,000 married same-sex couples in the country and another 85,000 who are in some non-marital form of relationship. The next set of slides are going to walk through some of the snapshots of the law at the state level, and we're going to start old school, when you had to be worried not only about being embarrassed if the police rolled up, but also being put in jail. All that's changed. So if you look at the next map, in 2003, the 13 remaining sodomy laws were declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. Can you take the map back one slide? I want you to pay attention to this geographic pattern, because in the next set of maps, you're either going to see this pattern or it's negative, and it's going to be one of the main points of our presentation, that while things are improving on the coasts and the upper Middle West, they're not improving equally across the country, and we need to focus on these states where things are lagging behind. In terms of non-discrimination laws in the last 10 years, they've more than doubled, from 11 states having non-discrimination laws that prohibit sexual orientation, and one that prohibits gender identity discrimination as well, to 20 different jurisdictions plus DC that prohibit either both or discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation in the workplace.
In terms of second-parent adoption laws, in 2001, we only had 5 states plus DC that had some sort of second-parent adoption mechanism. And today we have an additional over a dozen states, so we're up to 18 states plus DC that have second-parent adoption laws. There's been a lot of discussion about safe schools laws lately. When you look back just 10 years, we didn't have a single state that enumerated based on sexual orientation or gender identity. Today we have 14 states that have laws that are trans-inclusive and 3 states that have laws that enumerate based on sexual orientation. In terms of relationship recognition, in 2001, we had only 1 state with full rights and no states with marriage. And just a decade later, we have 5 states plus DC with marriage, 7 states with full rights, and 3 states with limited recognition.
So where do we find ourselves today? The next set of slides, and actually most of the rest of the presentation, is really going to be an attempt to define this moment in the history of the LGBT rights movement. The presentation is based on a memo that I wrote with Matt Coles, who I believe is not here, but has done a lot of the great strategic thinking for the movement. And we received input on this set of kind of 10 observations from a number of LGBT leaders. That said, everything that is about to follow, you can blame on Ineke and I. But I guess to channel David Letterman, top 10 things that define this moment in LGBT history. Number 10, or number 1. We'll start with the results of the 2010 election. And I think the rest of the presentation was a way to put context around the post-election blues that a number of us felt in November. So if you want to travel back in time to November, things didn't look like the last 10 weeks. They didn't feel so great, while we still had a president who was a fierce advocate for our rights with evolving views on marriage. We lost the House and got a narrow margin in the Senate. So that indicated for many of us that Congress would not be the most fertile place to spend our time, and perhaps we should look to federal administrative action and to the state level, but things definitely narrowed in the states, with us losing a number of governorships. And in terms of state legislatures, 13 different legislatures moved to be more controlled by Republicans, with 11 of them either flipping from Democratic control or to having a kind of divided control among the houses, to having both houses controlled by Republicans, 2 from Democratic control in both houses, 2 divided control. So our range of play in the states appeared to narrow as well. But before you get too depressed, Republican control in 2011 doesn't mean the same thing that it did in 2000 or 1990, and I don't think 10 years from now it will mean the same thing as it does today. There's growing evidence that LGBT issues are becoming what they should be, nonpartisan issues. That's demonstrated by the leadership. When you have people with the last names of Cheney and Bush and McCain coming out for marriage equality, I think you've reached a new moment in LGBT history. Hopefully the men will follow. And there's some evidence that among rank and file Republicans, there's been growing support on our issues as well. So what this slide does is compare the post-election polls from 2004 and 2010 on a set of questions to gauge support on legal recognition for same-sex couples. The party identification with the fastest growing support was Republicans. And if you look at the far side of the bar charts, support for marriage doubled from about 13% to about a quarter. If you look at the other side, opposition also decreased from almost 60% to just under 40%. So hopefully the wedge is losing its edge, and in time LGBT rights will truly be nonpartisan. In addition to growing Republican support, I think a defining aspect of this moment is just the vocal support of decision makers, of elected leaders, of judges that we've never seen in the history of the LGBT rights movement. If we may want things to be going more quickly, but if you think back to whether two governors would have actually mentioned in their inaugural addresses that marriage equality was a priority in their agenda, this is really unprecedented. Even if you have a president who's evolving, I think all of us felt psychologically so much better when that long overdue announcement that sexual orientation is entitled to heightened scrutiny came from the President of the United States and the Department of Justice. This is the type of leadership that we've needed and that we're now getting. It's not only among our elected officials. We have a new set of judicial heroes. These are 3 federal district court judges: Vaughn Walker, who declared Prop 8 unconstitutional; Virginia Phillips, who declared Don't Ask, Don't Tell unconstitutional; and Joseph Doro, who declared Section 3 of the Defense of Marriage Act unconstitutional. They're judges who've remembered what courts and constitutions are for.
So in addition to this growing political and judicial support, we're also becoming much better at working with allies. And Tim spoke about this briefly in his opening remarks, but I would say that in my observation, the LGBT movement is doing a lot more work that's not LGBT, and allied groups are doing a lot more work that is LGBT. And we're seeing this in various ways. We have mainstream kind of centrist or progressive groups like Center for American Progress, Third Way, Media Matters, who are making LGBT issues a big priority. And then also in specific issue areas, we've had great partnerships and allies, for instance, on issues of adoption and LGBT youth from groups like the Evan B. Donaldson Adoption Institute and the Child Welfare League of America. In a report that MAP and SAGE released last year on LGBT older adults, we had a foreword from the AARP and partnerships from the American Society on Aging and the National Senior Citizens Law Center. So I think we're seeing some huge progress in this area, and that the LGBT movement really is becoming part of the broader progressive movement. We're also seeing some growing public support. So I actually kind of find this question a little bit objectionable, or I don't like the fact that they ask it, but they've been asking it for about 11 years, which is around the moral acceptability of gay and lesbian relationships. And just 2.5 years ago, in 2008, that was the threshold year where support and opposition was about equal, and now we're looking at the trend line. We're actually in an America where more people believe gay and lesbian relations are morally acceptable than morally unacceptable. In terms of equal rights for job opportunities, this is employment non-discrimination. What you'll notice here is the lines look pretty flat. But what the good news is that we have really outstanding public support for non-discrimination laws. They're flatlining at around 90% of the public, which is amazing. One of the questions is, given this level of support, why haven't we made more traction, especially, you guys are all laughing, especially on issues like ENDA? And I'm sure that there are as many opinions on that probably as there are people in this room. But I would like to offer that I don't think there has been a lot of public education done around this issue. There was a 2007 Harris poll where only a third of respondents realized that someone could be fired just for being LGBT. So I just don't think Americans realize that this is an issue. This chart I'm going to pause on for a second. When you think about it, the change in support for marriage in the past 20 years has been truly astounding. 20 years ago, support was around 10%, and when you think 4% of the population is LGBT, that says how many straight people were supporting marriage. And we are now closing the gap where support is probably more in the 45 to 46% range. This is a chart that we borrowed from an analysis done by Nate Silver, who I think might be here, in which case thank you so much for this fabulous analysis. And what he did is, this data can be kind of confusing because we hear that support is over 50%, it's under 50%, but different marriage polls ask the questions differently, they use different methodologies, and so they get different results. And so he pulled all of the polls together and did a regression analysis, and that's why you see those trend lines. And the other noteworthy thing is, if you'll notice that the blue line is starting to increase sharply. And so what we're seeing is not only an increase in support for marriage, but also a more accelerated support for marriage. So we gained about 4 points in the last year and a half versus 1 to 1.5 points annually before that. Another way to look at this, 70% favor some form of relationship recognition. Now, while obviously we want marriage where that is feasible, what this does point out is that our opponents are becoming more and more marginalized in their extremist positions when they're asking for no form of relationship recognition whatsoever. Oops. And then I wanted to quickly comment on our sixth observation, which is, something that we've seen in the movement in the last half a year was this unprecedented national discussion on issues of bullying and suicide. As you all know, in the past 6 months, we've had some really tragic suicide deaths by youth who were gay or believed to be gay. And that has spurred an amazing national discussion, both of mainstream and in different celebrities like Ellen DeGeneres, but also the It Gets Better campaign, which was started by a blogger, Dan Savage. And that has actually spurred an incredible 10,000 people to create and post their own videos, including President Obama, Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, and LGBT staffers within the White House. So, when you think about this, it's just an indication that the national conversation is and can change, but it's also a little bit of a kind of point on the LGBT movement that this didn't come out of a national organization. This was something that arose fairly spontaneously and really grew through the power of social media.
So our seventh observation about this moment in LGBT history is that marriage is going to remain on the front burner, and we really can explain why in 2 words: Evan Wolfson. But in addition to Evan, or because of Evan, marriage will remain on the front burner for the next few years. One reason is some of the federal cases that I've already mentioned. Perry declaring Prop 8 unconstitutional. Most of the rest of the cases on this slide are the really smart challenges to Section 3 of DOMA by GLAAD and our legal groups. These are the cases that the president and the administration's announcement last week addressed when they said that we're entitled to heightened scrutiny and Section 3 is unconstitutional. Galinsky represents the limit of that decision, where the administration is saying they're going to continue to enforce DOMA, even though they don't defend its constitutionality. In that case, the very conservative chief judge of the Ninth Circuit said that an employee of the federal courts was entitled to equal spousal benefits for his same-sex partner. The administration is not going to provide them at this point because it's still enforcing DOMA. There's also a lot of exciting developments at the state level. There's about 12 states where marriage is in play. They're kind of equally divided in 3 groups where there are efforts to achieve marriage, to achieve a non-marital form of recognition. And thanks to Maggie Gallagher and company, there's about 4 states where we need to do 4 or 5 states where we need to do some work, either defending marriage, such as in New Hampshire and Iowa, or trying to block attempts to pass many defensive marriage acts at the state level. The next observation really is kind of the composite of all those maps that we showed you in the beginning. And if we look at the next slide, if you line all those up, what you see is that there is a geography to LGBT rights laws. And in about 28 states, there is no positive law at the state level. And so these are states with no recognition laws for same-sex couples. There's no anti-discrimination law. There's no anti-bullying or safe schools law that enumerates or specifies sexual orientation and gender identity. These are the states where our work is going to be different. And when we consulted with other movement leaders on what to call this, it may not be a wall. It may just mean that our work changes or gets more difficult. We can make progress in these states, but it's going to look different. We're going to have to work harder and smarter in these states than on the coast and some of the other areas where we've had progress. It's even a little worse than this map. If you look at the next map, there's a neat overlay with most of these states and the worst of the State Defense of Marriage Act. So the darkest color on here are the 19 states that have constitutional amendments that have superdomas, laws that not only prohibit marriage between same-sex couples, but also go after civil unions, domestic partnerships, any legal rights recognition for same-sex couples. So why do we need to work in these states? Because our community lives in these states as well, and we need to help those people who live throughout the country. We also need to do work in these, what we call the other 28 states, because to make progress at the national level, we know that the Supreme Court, we know that Congress pays attention to what's happening throughout the country. And there's no magic number, there's no tipping point, but they don't tend to get too far ahead of state law. So when the Supreme Court struck down the remaining sodomy laws in the United States, there was only 13 left. When Congress passed the Americans with Disability Act, most states had a state law that prohibited disability discrimination. So we're going to have to do the hard work in these states, not only to help the folks who live there, but to achieve full equality at the federal level. Why aren't we making progress in these states? We had a really robust conversation among a number of movement leaders about this. We came up with about 20 different reasons. Some of those reasons include that public opinion is just lagging behind in these states. These states are redder in general. There's less movement on progressive issues across the board. There may not be critical mass, and a lot of the local communities here are statewide to really create a movement to make change. And our national organizations have wisely gone where the opportunities are and have not focused as much on these states. That last factor is going to change, is changing right now. There is a concerted effort among a number of movement leaders to devise a strategy for moving forward in these 28 states. And I'll just end by saying, I'm not saying that nothing is happening in these 28 states. There's some great work happening at the local level. You saw in the video a little kind of shout out about Utah and its 10 and 10 campaign, a really smart strategic effort there to pass anti-discriminations at the local level in order to build the momentum to pass a state law. What they're doing in Utah to do that is exactly what we need to do around the country to work on federal progress.
So I'm going to offer some observations on the LGBT movement itself and then how movement resources are shifting. The LGBT movement, when you look at all of the LGBT organizations, or at least all of the ones we could find in GuideStar, which means they have 25,000 or more in revenue, there's over 550 LGBT nonprofits, and collectively they have almost 575 million in revenue. About half of those goes to community centers and health services, and the rest goes to advocacy, litigation, social, research groups, etc. And although the types of groups are diverse, what we're seeing is that the revenue is actually quite concentrated by geography. So all but a third of that revenue goes to groups in California, New York, or national organizations in DC. And I think this is both a reflection of and also a contributing factor to the lack of progress that we were seeing in those states in the earlier map. The movement itself is also changing. If you look at the logos that are on the top, these are organizations that have really kind of popped up in the last few years, but have really risen very quickly and powerfully onto the national scene. So to some degree, things like this, like the It Gets Better campaign, it's showing a decentralization in the LGBT movement. The logos on the bottom, these are obviously all campaign logos, and what I'd like to comment on here is both the amount of funds that we can raise quickly, but also the amount of funds it's taking to do some of our work. So you look at Prop 8 alone, it was $41 million for the No on 8 campaign. It is absolutely astounding that we could raise that kind of money in that short a time frame. I think the American Foundation for Equal Rights just raised over $3 million with their Elton John concert. And it is, that's fantastic to see, but the flip side of that is that these numbers are starting to become table stakes for playing the game. So when you looked at all those states with constitutional amendments against marriage, if we want to make progress in those states, we're going to have to go in and do ballot initiatives, and those ballot initiatives are expensive. So resources are going to continue to be a challenge in the LGBT movement. And part of the challenge here is that we just did an analysis. You have a report in your bags about this, but giving by LGBT adults isn't, where we would hope for it to be. A very optimistic analysis would show that less than 4% of LGBT adults in the US gave $35 or more to one of 39 leading LGBT organizations, including all the groups in this room. I think partly because of the economic downturn, partly because of these giving challenges, we have seen some significant revenue drops for our leading organizations. Between 2008 and 2009, revenue dropped by 1/5 or 20%, and we're seeing 2010 budgets being even lower. The good news is that our organizations are responding really well to the downturn. They're taking the steps that they need to, so they're remaining healthy. They're not in financial crisis. They have working capital to cover their expenses. And they're continuing to be efficient in their fundraising operations. So we're only seeing about 12% fundraising cost, with about 80% still spent on programs. And it's a good thing that our organizations are healthy because, and these are our last few slides here, our opponents are very well resourced and effective. We did a little analysis as part of this report to look at how well financed we are versus our opponents. And just the top 10 anti-LGBT activist groups alone have more than double the revenue of all 39 of the national movement groups that we looked at. They're also proving effective in their tactics. The removal of the justices in Iowa, their success on Prop 8, their success in Maine, these are some examples of that. Their messaging has become very effective. These ads with children talking about marriage or LGBT issues in schools, which is the top image, and also trying to counter non-discrimination, inclusive non-discrimination ordinances with claims that these will allow sexual predators into restrooms.
So where does this leave us? I think where it leaves us, and really for this conference, is not in the spirit of the 2010 election, but really in the momentum of what Tim defined as the last 10 weeks. This isn't a time to wait and see. This is a time to act and do. And these are some of the possibilities that we think the 10 observations point to. While things may be blocked in Congress, we've really had some terrific successes at the federal level with administrative change. There's every indication that this administration is not slowing down at this point in light of the 2012 election, so we need to press forward there. We need to press forward in state and local initiatives in the states where we do have opportunities, and the folks here throughout the conference will talk to you about that. The national discussion around LGBT youth has created the opportunity to move forward on safe school laws, and I think the momentum to do that. Those are good first laws to push for in some of these 28 states where we need to make progress. And if we're going to pass INDA, it would be great support to have more state laws that prohibit discrimination in the workplace, and federal executive orders, administrative changes that build the body experience that says those arguments that our opponents make against INDA just aren't true. And what we need to do and what this conference is all about is using this time to build the resources for our community, to build the foundation, to make change throughout the country. We need to continue to build relationships with our allies. We need to continue the public education campaigns and start them that win the hearts and minds of Americans throughout the country and in every region. And we need to do what this conference is all about. We need to engage ourselves and engage our community.
Thank you.